When Caroline Levitt sat down for the interview, she expected a debate. What she didn't expect was a moment so explosive it would bring down one of the most recognizable TV hosts overnight. It happened live, not in some pre-recorded segment where producers could step in, edit things out, or smooth over the rough edges. No, this was raw, unfiltered, and happening in real time. Caroline Levitt had been invited onto The Morning Current, a political talk show known for its sharp debates and even sharper hosts. The man across from her, veteran journalist Paul Danning, had made a career out of pushing buttons. His interviews were aggressive, his style relentless. He wasn't just there to moderate, he was there to win. And today, his opponent was a young, rising conservative voice who refused to back down. The segment started predictably. Paul pressed Caroline on her stance regarding media bias, accusing conservative outlets of peddling misinformation while claiming networks like his were simply correcting the record. She countered with facts, listing instances where mainstream news had misrepresented stories, omitted key details, or outright misled the public. It was tense but professional. For a moment, it seemed like just another spirited debate. But then something changed. Paul leaned forward, his expression tightening. His tone, once measured, took on an edge. He was no longer debating, he was attacking. "People like you," he said, his voice laced with frustration, "are the reason this country is backsliding. You push this fake narrative of victimhood, pretending conservatives are being silenced, when in reality, you're the ones silencing everyone else." The studio went silent. Caroline blinked, her posture still composed, but her eyes sharpened. She had handled aggressive interviews before, but this was different. She let the moment hang in the air before responding. "Excuse me?" Paul didn't back down. In fact, he doubled down. "You act like free speech is under attack, but what you really want is control. Your people." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The damage was done. The energy in the studio shifted. The producers, once passively observing, now exchanged glances. The crew members stiffened, waiting to see what would happen next. And Caroline, she didn't shout. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She simply asked, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by your people?" The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Paul hesitated, just for a second. But a second was all it took. The cameras were still rolling. The internet was watching. Paul Danning wasn't a man who backed down easily. His entire career had been built on controlling the conversation, steering it where he wanted. But this time, he had lost the reins. The moment those two words, "your people," left his mouth, something shifted. It wasn't just a poor choice of phrasing, it was the implication behind it. The kind of phrase that could be dissected, twisted, and replayed 1,000 times over. And Caroline knew it. She sat back, folding her hands in her lap, giving him the space to either correct himself or sink deeper. Paul inhaled sharply. "I meant conservatives," he said, too quickly. "People like you who push an agenda of grievance instead of progress." Caroline tilted her head slightly. "So just to be clear," she said, her voice measured, "when you said your people, you weren't referring to anything beyond political ideology?" Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. He had been in the game long enough to recognize a trap. If he pushed back, he risked confirming what people were already thinking. If he admitted it was a mistake, he looked weak. So instead, he shifted the goalposts. "Oh, come on, Caroline. Don't play the victim here," he said, forcing out a dry chuckle. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." But the damage was done. Social media exploded. Within minutes, clips of the moment flooded Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Comment sections erupted. Caroline Levitt trends #1. Memes surfaced, some sarcastically captioned, "Define your people, Paul." Others compiled a montage of mainstream hosts making the same mistake. Only this time, the audience wasn't looking the other way. The backlash was immediate. Viewers demanded an apology. Others demanded his resignation. Paul Danning's network scrambled. Executives released a statement about misinterpretation and clarifying intent. Paul himself went silent. By the next morning, advertisers were pulling out. By the end of the week, Paul Danning was taking an extended leave. And Caroline? She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She had done what no one else had managed to do. She had exposed the very bias and hypocrisy Paul claimed didn't exist. And now, the world wasn't looking away. This is bad faith outrage. You know exactly what I meant, Paul Danning snapped, frustration creeping into his voice. But instead of engaging with the actual argument, you'd rather twist my words and make it about you. Caroline Levitt didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him redirect. I don't need to twist anything. Paul, your words speak for themselves. A flicker of something crossed his face, irritation, maybe even a hint of regret. But he was too deep in it now. He couldn't afford to backpedal, so he made a fatal mistake. You know what? Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. There it was. A blanket statement. Arrogance. Live on air. The silence that followed was suffocating, not just in the studio, but on the other side of the screen, where thousands, soon to be millions, were watching. Even Paul seemed to realize it the second the words left his mouth. His lips parted as if to soften the blow, but it was too late. Caroline let the words hang in the air before responding. Are you saying conservatives don't contribute to society, Paul? He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. I'm saying this constant whining about being canceled is exhausting. Caroline nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. But her silence said everything. The damage had been done, and within minutes, the internet would explode. The fallout. The moment the segment ended, the first clips hit social media. A 15-second snippet of Paul Danning's words. Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society. No context, no prelude, just that sentence. Within an hour, the hashtags were trending. #Fire Paul Danning, media bias exposed, Caroline was right. Some took it at face value, blasting Paul for what they saw as outright disrespect. Others scrambled to defend him, claiming it was a misinterpretation, but the full-length clip didn't help his case. If anything, it made it worse. Political commentators on both sides pounced. Some condemned him outright. Others spun it as yet another example of selective outrage. But no matter the stance, one thing was clear. People were watching. Then the sponsors got involved. By midday, 3 major advertisers for the Morning Current had suspended their partnerships, releasing carefully worded statements about reviewing their commitments to the network. By evening, 5 more had followed. Damage control mode activated. Paul, for his part, stayed silent, at least for now. But the network, they had a crisis on their hands. Caroline? She didn't have to say a word. She simply retweeted the clip, adding nothing but a thinking face emoji. But the storm wasn't over yet, because now the network had to make a decision. The network's crisis inside the headquarters of NBS News, the network behind the Morning Current, executives were in full-blown crisis mode. The outrage wasn't dying down, it was intensifying. Viewers flooded the network's inbox with demands for action. Advertisers weren't just pausing sponsorships anymore, they were pulling out entirely. And to make matters worse, other networks started piling on, using Paul Danning's comments as a case study on media arrogance. By mid-morning, an emergency meeting was called. The network had 2 choices: defend Paul and risk more fallout, cut ties and protect their reputation. For years, Paul Danning had been one of their star personalities, a veteran journalist with a reputation for hard-hitting interviews, but now he was a liability. At 3 p.m., an official statement was released. Paul Danning has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review of yesterday's broadcast. NBS News remains committed to respectful and fair journalism. It was corporate speak for, we're seeing how bad this gets before we throw him overboard. But the internet had zero patience for half measures. A suspension wasn't enough. People wanted termination. And Caroline? She wasn't leading the charge, but she wasn't stopping it either. Later that evening, she appeared on another show where she was asked directly, "Do you think Paul Danning should be fired?" She leaned forward, clasped her hands together, and smiled slightly before answering. "I think actions have consequences, and I think people are tired of being told what to think by those who don't actually listen." The clip went viral instantly. Within 24 hours, Paul Danning was officially fired. NBS News framed it as a mutual decision. But everyone knew the truth. He had become too toxic to keep. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the fallout continued. Paul tried to pivot to independent media, claiming he was a victim of cancel culture, but nobody was buying it. His network moved on without him, filling his slot with a safer, less controversial figure. And Caroline? She had just cemented herself as a rising force in political media. More interviews, more invitations, more influence. But the bigger story wasn't just about Paul Danning's downfall. It was about what it revealed. That the old media guard, the ones who had controlled the narrative for years, were no longer untouchable. The internet had changed everything, and now the mainstream media was on notice. The question was no longer who controls the conversation. It was, who's really listening? Do you think Paul Danning should be fired? Caroline Levitt paused for just a moment, then delivered her response with precision. I think people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words. It was measured, strategic, and devastating. Because the next morning, NBS News made its final decision. At 9:15 a.m., they announced, effective immediately, Paul Danning is no longer affiliated with NBS News. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. The media world erupted. Some called it justice. Others called it an overreaction. But one thing was certain. Paul Danning was finished. And the conversation was only getting started. The aftermath, Paul Danning was gone, but the controversy was far from over. His firing split the country in two. One side saw it as a long overdue reckoning, proof that media figures couldn't talk down to half the country and get away with it anymore. To them, Paul's comments weren't just offensive, they were revealing. A glimpse into the condescending attitude that had defined mainstream media for decades. The other side called it cancel culture at its worst. So a man loses his job for one comment? A single misstep? What happened to debate? What happened to context? Right-wing commentators took full advantage. Fox News, The Daily Wire, and Newsmax ran segment after segment dissecting the firing. Meanwhile, left-leaning figures tried to distance themselves from Paul, but some were quietly uneasy. Even those who disagreed with him recognized the implications, because if a veteran journalist could be fired overnight, then who was next? Paul Danning breaks his silence. Then, Paul broke his silence. Late one evening, he released a pre-recorded video statement on social media. His face looked tired. His tone was calm but firm. I was fired because I spoke the truth. The media doesn't want truth, they want compliance. If you step out of line, you're gone. If you challenge the narrative, they erase you. This isn't about me, it's about all of us. The video racked up millions of views within hours. His supporters rallied, calling for boycotts against NBS News. His critics pushed back, arguing that this wasn't some grand conspiracy, he had simply crossed a line. And Caroline? She kept quiet. She didn't gloat. She didn't engage in the drama. She let the world argue for her. The bigger question. But this wasn't just about Paul anymore. This was about the future of media itself. The dust was settling, but the questions his firing had raised, they weren't going anywhere. In the days that followed, every major media outlet ran think pieces and panel discussions on what had just happened. Was this justice or was it censorship? Some saw it as a long overdue moment of accountability, a message that elite media figures weren't untouchable anymore. They argued that Paul's firing wasn't about free speech, it was about professionalism. Words have weight. When a journalist crosses a line, they face the consequences. Simple as that. Others weren't so sure. They warned that the real danger wasn't Paul Danning losing his job, it was what it meant for the future. Are we punishing people for their mistakes, or are we erasing people for having the wrong opinions? The debate stretched far beyond Paul and Caroline. It became about the power of viral outrage, the role of social media in shaping reality, the fragile state of public discourse, Paul Danning's next move. As for Paul, he was out, but he wasn't done. Within a month, he launched his own independent show on YouTube, branding himself as a truth-teller silenced by the establishment. His audience, larger than ever. And Caroline? She moved on. But her name would always be tied to this moment. She hadn't just debated a TV host, she had changed the game. The bigger picture. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Was this justice served, or a dangerous precedent? Did Paul's firing restore accountability, or did it prove that public pressure controls the media? And most importantly, who decides what crosses the line? The final thought. One thing is certain, this won't be the last time a moment like this happens. And when it does, The question remains, whose side will you be on? Join the conversation. What do you think? Should Paul have been fired? Or was this an example of cancel culture going too far? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think. Because in a world full of noise, the truth still matters.